1, 2, 3, 4. One, two, three, four.
Ja, jetzt höre ich was.
Eins, zwei, drei, vier. Good morning.
Ziemlich laut.
Ziemlich laut und laut. Dann müssen wir das ein Stück runterstellen. Das ist zu sehr, zu laut.
Würde ich fast ein bisschen runter machen, wenn wir irgendwo das ist sehr laut. Also vielleicht irgendwo so ein bisschen. Also das Grundbrummen wäre schön wegzukriegen. Vielleicht jetzt so. Ja.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Kann man mich gut verstehen? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ja? Ist das besser? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Test. Test, Test, Test. Okay. Willst du auch einmal hören, wie es klingt? So testweise? Sind wir erstmal zufrieden, ja? Also ich denke, das war gut so.
Hey, how are you? I'm sorry for my silence.
How are you?
Yeah, I thought they probably think I'm not going. But if I said I come, hey, how are you doing? How has it been so far?
Gut. Ja.
I was following online a bit. Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of philosophical discussions also.
Yeah, I think
Probably, I mean, the empiricism is always a little bit lower in this power.
Yeah, I thought it would be high. I
live streaming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We actually put him second now. Like we changed so the order from there, and we thought we'd start with the Lina, and because they were all with us, then go to Thea, and we saw like the landscape perspective in Stockholm, also that kind of thing, but also Ethiopia.
Yeah,
And then follow with you.
that's okay.
Ethiopia, and then the end of the
Over biodiversity.
yeah, science one. Again, it's quite fast.
Yeah, that's good.
And then, so be offensive when it's there.
Ja, wenn ich hier mal ins WLAN komme.
Your face.
What is it? What is it?
Okay, so I just tweet it again that it gets started in half an hour.
No one sees. No speakers, no audience. Well,
Also wenn ich euch über mein Telefon suche, finde ich euer Channel.
Hast du beim vom Blog eigentlich Okay, good morning everyone. We'll actually get started right on time because the interesting thing hopefully will come later, not me right now, but rather later when we have a discussion session following the presentations. So we're here today to talk about food security and biodiversity conservation and how to integrate these two things. My name's Jörn Fischer. I'm a professor at Leuphana University in Lüneburg in Germany and at the Faculty of Sustainability, and together with my colleague Jan Hansbach, who's here as well, we'll be taking you through this session here. The idea is that we've got two major challenges at the same time here globally at the moment. One is food security, one is biodiversity conservation, and for both of them we've got some pretty grim statistics in terms of the state of these kinds of these problems. So people are saying with respect to food security it's kind of getting better, but it depends very much on which statistics you believe, whether this is actually the case or not the case at all. And for biodiversity it's pretty much agreed that we're now on the verge of the 6th mass extinction event in the history of our planet. So we're in trouble on both of these issues, and the question is how can we reconcile these two issues, and that's what this session is going to be about. With this question in mind, a couple of years ago we worked in our research group on just trying to get an overview of how people have addressed this topic of food security and biodiversity conservation so far. And for that we did a literature review of approximately 100 papers, and we asked a set of structured questions of all these different papers to see how different people address the topic of food security and biodiversity conservation. What we found was that people address these topics in very different ways. And essentially, there is a literature cluster that is biophysical technological in its focus, and there's another cluster of literature which is quite separate, which is a social political cluster with very different foci. Over the next few slides, I'll just give you some examples before we then launch into a set of presentations by speakers that we have here today who will present their perspective on how to get food security and biodiversity conservation sorted out together. So let's have a look at some examples from the biophysical technological cluster. So one classic one is this idea of sustainable intensification, and this quote here is quite representative in a sense. The idea here is that defining better targets for more environmentally sustainable intensification of production must address the whole food system. Although we focus primarily on the production sector, it's also critical to recognize other efficiencies such as food loss and food storage. So this is very much typical of this literature on sustainable intensification. There is a rhetoric of talking about the system as a whole, but in practice the focus very much ends up on production. The other focus on the other sort of aspect or the other group of literature that we found on this biophysical cluster has an even more overt production focus. This is the classic narrative that we must double food production to meet growing demands of a growing and increasingly wealthy global population. So the idea here is very much, first of all, we've got to double production and then worry about the rest. This kind of production-oriented focus is very much in contrast with what we see on this sort of more social political side of things, where, for example, the agroecology focus is something like agroecology-based production systems are biodiverse, resilient, energetically efficient, socially just, and comprise the basis of an energy productive and food sovereignty strategy. So very different ideas come in when you listen to people like Altieri talk about food security and biodiversity conservation than when you listen to what we heard earlier. There was a quote by John Foley there, for example. So different ideas around, and what we want to do today is hear from 5 different people how to tackle this nexus of food security and biodiversity conservation. These people have different expertise and different foci, different backgrounds. We'll have 8-minute presentations by each of these people, giving us approximately 40 minutes of time to have a panel discussion afterwards. So please save your questions till the end, and then we'll have an interesting discussion, hopefully. At the end, we'll also do a short 5-minute synthesis, trying to understand areas of agreement already and disagreement where people maybe have shared ideas and where maybe we still have disagreement. All of this is being live streamed at the moment, so welcome to people who are watching online perhaps, and more on our own research you can find out at the website below. With that, I'd like to ask our first speaker, which is Line Gordon from the Stockholm Resilience Center.
Thank you. I'm extremely excited to be here. I think it's a very interesting topic to talk about. I'm going to take a very broad brush view and talk about some of the major challenges we have in the sort of food, health, sustainability interface and how that then relates to food security and biodiversity. And I'm going to draw much on the paper that we just, it's hopefully coming up any day soon. It's accepted in environmental research letters. But what we try to do in that paper is to look at how we can address the sort of food health and sustainability complex. And by doing that, you have to understand both what's happening on the production side and on the consumption side. And there's so much literature on this, of course, already. And a lot of it is under sort of food systems thinking. And I don't know how many of you have been Googling food systems conceptual framework or something and look at the figures, but they're often extremely complex because there's so many actors and so much activity across the whole sort of value chain between production and consumption. And part of what we wanted to do is to try to get this broad picture of what is actually happening if we're interested in both the consumer side and the production side, but a little bit less interested in all the details in the whole food system. So we draw on sort of social ecological system thinking and use some of the basic concepts or conceptual figures in social ecological systems. So this figure, I think most of you in here are familiar with, where we see the economy as part of the society, as part of the biosphere, where sort of if economy and society grows, you also can't grow the biosphere, and it takes over more of the space and the less safe operating space kind of in the biosphere. We redid that and looked instead at sort of the health as an outcome of food systems, and food systems as part of the biosphere. And we looked at three aspects of food systems that are particularly important for human health. So safety, volume, and nutrition. And health, we looked at underweight and overweight and how that has changed over time. And then in terms of biosphere, we looked at the 6 of the planetary boundaries, at least what are particularly important for food, and where food has a major impact on these boundaries. And then we analyzed how has these different aspects changed over time, so from 1960 until today. And as you can see here, when it comes to health, basically we almost half the problems if you look at the percentage of population that is suffering from undernourishment. However, we also doubled the amount of people that have, not the amount, the percentage of people that are suffering from overweight, going from, I think it's 18% in 1980, we couldn't get data back to 1960, to almost 40% currently, globally, that have problems with overweight. Food production is actually food consumption is actually the main driver today for early death. So if we look at the different components of the food system that's sort of driving this change, volume was one of the components that we looked at. And I would argue that today we don't really have a problem with volume. That doesn't mean that everyone has the amount of food that they need. We have massive problems with access and distribution and so on. But also if you look at some of the data, in 1960, 53% of the global population lived in countries that produced less than 2,000 calories per person per day. And today it's 3% that has less than 2,000 calories per day, or live in countries with that. That is not equally distributed within the countries, but still, volume is not the main problem. However, we still have massive problems when it comes to nutrition and nutritional content of both what we produce and then also how we refine the products and what we then consume. So we still believe the same sort of magnitude of problems related to the nutritional content of what we eat. Safety, we've been able to handle some of the food safety issues like foodborne diseases in big parts of the world at least. However, we have new safety issues emerging with antibiotic resistance and so on. When it comes to the biosphere, as you can see here, what the light color shows is that we have transgressed the boundaries, the light color shows how big a human impact we have if you consider all human activities. The dark is if you only look at the food system. So the food system is today the major driver for transgressing several of the planetary boundaries. if we look back in 1960, we were, at least the food system part, were within the safe operating space, except for when it comes to biodiversity. So when we looked at that, we identified 4 major points of interventions where we feel there's key points where we have to address. So one is, how do we find healthy and sustainable patterns that go together? The other one is, how do we improve efficient resource use? And that's both looking at waste and it's looking at eating more of the plants and using less as feed. We have to improve the nutritional content of what we're producing to go for more nutrition-rich landscapes, and then curb antibiotic microbials or antimicrobials. All of these have implications for biodiversity and the type of diversity that we calculate and can have in our landscapes. And I think that would be interesting to reflect with all of you on. I'm running out of time, but briefly we also looked at how consumers and producers are coupled and how that has also shifted over time. And we looked at the production side, where if we draw on the sort of more classic figure, we see a farm as embedded in a landscape, a region, a biosphere. And on the people side, the social side, we see individuals as embedded in communities, embedded in nations, and then in the global system. And the way that we make decisions as consumers are very much shaped from this food environment and how the community and the nation and that we live in. So if we also look at what's happened over time, we've basically gone more from a system that had more local interactions to a system that's very much dominated by global trade and consolidated actors. So we see more distant production, we have a reduction in transparency, we see a growth in fewer and more consolidated actors, and we see much of a changed food environment also, the context in which individuals make their decisions. And we see decoupling between producers and consumers. So what we need to really try to get at is a more transparent information, changed value system where we go from just looking at producers as producers to actually seeing them as biosphere stewards. We need to improve this decision-making context so we can make easier decisions that are healthy and sustainable. And we need to reconnect to the biosphere. These are not easy things, of course, but these are aspects that we need to take into account in moving forward. And I would really like to emphasize this of culture and stewardship and just give 2 quick examples of my favorite farmer, a Swedish guy called Adam Arnesson. He also calls himself the eco-farmer or ekobonden. He redefined what he sees himself as from a farmer to a planetary steward, and that's it. He's actively using that when he talks about what he's trying to do. He's an organic lamb farmer, and he's shifted his production, so he's cultivating much more beans and peas and pulses and less lamb, and he's gone from feeding 60 people to 180 people out of his land by doing this shift in production system. The other side here, you see the first meeting of the Keystone Dialogue, which is getting the biggest CEOs of the biggest fisheries company together. And it's about 10 companies now that signed up to a dialogue of how to shift their impact on the oceans to becoming ocean stewards rather than the ones that are drawing up the fish from the oceans. So I think that type of mental shift is very important in addressing these questions. I also think we do need to look at gastronomic intervention and innovations, because we have to find a system that's both healthy and sustainable, and that's also attractive. And we had a chef with us in the session earlier this week, and this is from his restaurant. And what you see here is, for example, the leek, and he's so proud of the leek, where he really, we really ate all of it. I mean, it was roots, and it was all of the leek. And then what you see here is also a soup, and it's a cover crop from Farmer's Field that we also ate at that dinner, not in this session, but or not here, but at the restaurant. So how can we find innovations also that are gastronomic also across the whole farming system? I end with this question, I'll leave it for you to read them, but this is what I think is important in the discussions that we're going to have today. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nina. We're going to come back to the summary slides later on. The next speaker will be Thea Czarnke from Georg University in Göttingen, Germany.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks. First of all, thanks a lot for Jan and Björn for organizing this interesting session. So my talk is also about linking biodiversity and biodiversity services, which will not come as a surprise to you. And I also start with these points that there are these conflicting challenges. On the one hand, the fact that agriculture is a main driver of extinction, of biodiversity losses. And on the other hand, there's this interest or this global food demand, meaning that production should be doubled in the coming decades. I think when you address these points, an important aspect is that you look at developments at different spatial scales, because there is a scale mismatch which has to be considered. You can look at these systems on the plant, in the field, in the landscape, and on a global level. And figures and patterns change a lot across these levels, both from an ecological viewpoint as well as from a social and economic viewpoint. Most people are interested on the field level. Farmers are interested on the field level only, and also conservationists are often focused on the field level. Policies, EU policies, for example, are focused on the field level, whereas the landscape species pool, for example, is the main driver of what is going on in these fields and in terms of biodiversity services. And things are completely different when you look on the global level. So, and I will address this step by step by going through these different scales. So local management takes place on a household level. So it's mainly driven by the farmers and their, let's say, their egoistic interest to maximize production or whatever. And when you want to combine, to integrate biodiversity services in agriculture, it's about reducing the hostility in these agroecosystems in favor of functional biodiversity, which you want to include in production as will be done, for example, in organic agriculture. And there are these certain features which you all know. Crop diversification is a major point of enhancing biodiversity in fields. You have to reduce fertilizer applications and pesticide application. The main point is also to cap the yield peaks of these high-yielding varieties in favor of adapted varieties, which needs less external input. And maintaining small fields is also an important point. Maintaining small fields on a landscape scale can be as important compared to big fields as a switch from conventional to organic agriculture in terms of biodiversity increases. But the efficiency, and this is here in red, the efficiency of local management depends on, as I said, on the landscape-wide species pools of, or pools of species and populations. When you have only very few species on the landscape scale, you can do what you want on your local field. You won't get a huge biodiversity, also little functional biodiversity. When you have a very rich species pool on the landscape scale, you can even intensify, and still there are colonizing species, plant species, and, for example, insect species compensating for your local intensification. So landscape level is important. This is kind of village level. So there are socially different drivers acting. For example, the village head needs to integrate interest of different stakeholders, so that's more consensus-oriented, not as egoistic approach as on the farm level. And from a biodiversity point of view, you may aim at a 20% semi-natural habitat, which has been shown to be kind of a minimum amount of habitat to support functional diversity. But you also need to have habitat connectivity, so that colonizing or spillover among habitats plays a role, and that you have in the end large species pool. So spillover plays a role, I will come back to that in a minute, across crops, crop boundaries and natural habitats. And last but not least, you may even design this landscape connectivity, but this is difficult and needs regulations or incentives which are not available so far. So I give here an example of how this may look like, of combining land sharing and land sparing in multifunctional landscape. So point one means that you have spillover from natural habitats to agroecosystems, so which can be important for, let's say, for biological control or for pollination in these systems. You have a spillover from crop boundaries to agroecosystems, and you need this landscape connectivity so that you have, on the one hand, biodiversity services, which depend on common species. You have also biodiversity conservation in protected areas, and a connectivity matrix stabilizing all these populations. The global perspective, as I said, is different. It's linked to a national government level, and you have these, as has been said several times, these huge differences in wealth, in opportunities, governance, competition of food markets. Very important is, in my mind, to focus on smallholders. Smallholders are the backbone of global food security. 90% of the farms globally have less than 2 hectares. And so if you really want to decrease hunger and poverty in the world, you have to focus on these systems and not to increase, let's say, food production in these large-scale farms that we have here. So it's about small and adapted, not big agricultural projects. So it's my last slide already. So integrating biodiversity services in agriculture has certain challenges. You have to acknowledge this scale mismatch from local land use practices and landscape species pools to evolutionary patterns, because on the global scale, endemics and evolutionary histories play a big role for biodiversity conservation, which are not so relevant on a local and landscape scale. And from this more egoistic household and to a consensus-oriented village level up to competing national governance level. You have on the local scale, it's about adapted crop diversification in small fields. On the landscape level, it's about the connectivity matrix and species pools. And on the global scale, this focus on small-scale solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thea. Our next speaker is going to be Christopher Lander from Stockholm University.
Hello. I'm also very happy to be invited to this session. I'm an ecologist, and so I've not worked on research on food, but I work a lot in Ethiopia and on rural landscapes in Ethiopia. So, and then I meet the food question all the time, of course. So hopefully I can have some perspectives from that experiences. So I will give you some perspectives on distribution of biodiversity in Ethiopian agricultural landscapes. And I think this debate about food security and biodiversity, then it's important to think over what we mean with food security, of course, and what we mean with biodiversity. And sometimes when people discuss, they mean very different things with biodiversity, so that is my focus here. So there are 3 common narratives. There are, of course, many others, and also in each landscape locally there might be many other perspectives, but one common narrative is that agriculture is threatening wild biodiversity. This is an example from an oil palm plantation that had replaced rainforest in Borneo, for example. Another narrative is that agriculture, or areas with a legacy of traditional farming, or that still have traditional farming management, those areas are harboring a unique biodiversity worth of protection. And here I have a picture from a semi-natural grassland in Sweden, where you can see on the picture a lot of different flowers, and at very small scale you can have a high diversity. The third narrative is that there is a positive synergy between protecting ecosystem services like pollinators and natural pest controllers and biodiversity conservation, and vice versa. And this narrative is very, very common nowadays in all policy documents at the EU level and at many different NGOs, etc. And at this conference, this is also, I think, what a lot of people have hope in. This picture from agricultural landscape in southwestern Ethiopia. This is perhaps the luscious part of Ethiopia. You have seen pictures from other places, and a lot of people traveling to Ethiopia travel in the European winter when it's dry season, so then it's yellow. You show the pictures of the yellow dry landscape, but when you come in September or August, it looks like this. So I will go through the three narratives with a perspective from the landscapes I've been working in. So the first narrative about agriculture threatening biodiversity, wild biodiversity. I think this is true in this landscape. This is a picture. We have looked at forest cover over 40 years, and the green is forest cover that is remaining. The red is what has been deforested, and the white is still open agriculture areas, and the blue is reforested. So there is a decrease in forest cover. And when we look at drivers, one important driver is the coffee cover. So coffee is grown in the margins of the forest, and where you have coffee in the margins, farmers maintain the coffee, and they don't expand the annual crop into the forest. At higher elevations where coffee can't grow, you have higher deforestation rates. So with climate change, coffee might be able to grow at higher elevations, and maybe people are starting to plant trees again in the forest margins, and that could be positive for forest cover at new altitudes. International markets are driving the coffee price, maybe, etc., etc. So coffee is the main driver of the landscape patterns here. Migration is also an important driver, where population growth forces people to move to new places and open up forests and cut down and start annual crop growing, and also resettlements because of conflicts between Ethiopia and Eritrea, etc. So there are many different drivers for these kind of changes. The second narrative about areas of traditional farming, that they house a unique biodiversity. This is a narrative that is, if you talk with scholars in Ethiopia that have been taught about biodiversity, they don't think this is really an important thing in Ethiopia. They focus mostly on that the forest is good and has biodiversity, and people are cutting down the forest. But actually, when you start to look in the agriculture landscapes in Ethiopia, you see a very, very high biodiversity. This is a graph that compares the number of bird species in forest, and with the black line, and in home gardens with the gray lines. And as you see, the number of forests, these rarefied curves, shows that the gardens are much richer than the forest, actually. And it's also true that there are unique biodiversity in the gardens that are not found in the forest. And this pattern occurs for many different species groups. And we have not looked at everything, but I'm sure you will find similar things in many groups of organisms. So there is more to to this point in the Ethiopian landscape that is neglected. Then the third narrative about the synergy between biodiversity and ecosystem services. This is probably a much more complex question than you might think of when you start looking at it. This is a graph showing the attacks on these fake caterpillars. We put up clay and looked at bite marks from birds and arthropods, and then we saw that actually in simple landscapes you had higher attack rates than in complex landscape, just contradicting to what you would think, and that arthropods were more important than birds. We also saw in this experiment, and I don't think we should go into details in interpreting why it's like this, but my take-home point is that this synergy between a lot of biodiversity and ecosystem services might not be very easy and might not be very simple. And most species are actually rare and maybe don't contribute to the ecosystem services that the farmer is needed. And also when we work in these landscapes and we'll interview farmers, what are the benefits from the forest to your farm and what are the problems? They talk about both ecosystem services and ecosystem disservices. There are organisms that are very problematic, like raiding pigs and baboons coming to the farms, but also so these whole questions of biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services is a much more complex question. So I think priorities for future research in Ethiopia and in many agricultural landscapes, in order to set the baseline also for discussions about food and biodiversity, is that we need to understand the drivers of land use change more in depth. We need to look at biodiversity in tropical cultural landscapes and actually look more at these kind of things that we acknowledge in old cultural landscapes, for example in Sweden, are probably occurring in many more places in the world than we think. And also do research on synergies and trade-offs between different biodiversity conservation programs and ecosystem services and the other way around, so that we don't fall into naive belief that is actually not true. So that were my final points for discussion.
Thank you very much, Christopher. So we're going to keep the Ethiopian perspective, and we continue with Rosalind Weymans from Addis Ababa.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope I can put up my presentation too. And it's indeed, it's nice to see the previous presentations, because I will present a rather simple but a little bit controversial case study of Ethiopia that builds and that touch upon aspects of the previous presentations. My background is mainly from the link between nutrition and biodiversity. Sorry, my head is too small, I think. It's fallen much. And so I will focus on this. Can I maybe use the Thank you. Hello? Hello? Yeah. I will use this example of indirect contributions of forests to diet diversity. Now, very shortly on the link between nutrition and biodiversity, as has already been mentioned a bit by Line, biodiversity is very important from the nutrition perspective, and adding a nutrition dimension to the discussion on food security and biodiversity changes that discussion quite a lot, I think. One, for a healthy diet, you need a diversity of foods and nutrients. Second, it's not only the diversity and the quantity, but it's also the quality of those foods. And many of the ecosystem services contribute to these. There are an increasing number of studies that show that pollinator diversity and soil diversity contribute to the quality of the foods that we produce. Third, also in terms of other broader ecosystem services that contribute to the safety of the foods as well as of the drinking water. So this adds to this idea of ecosystem services that are important for nutrition. Of course, there are also trade-offs, and if we look on the other hand, biodiversity is also dependent on nutrition and what the consumer demands. So the consumer demand drives a lot of the changes in the food system. Also the way the markets function, as landscapes get more connected to markets, to international as well as local markets, the dynamics of the local food production as well as the interaction with the landscape and the local biodiversity changes. And third, this then influences the production location and the practices where those foods are produced and their influence on biodiversity. Now, I will build upon this study that was done by a colleague, Amy Ikovic, and that shows that did a large-scale study on the interaction between forest, trees, and biodiversity. And they saw that across the African continent, there was a strong association between tree cover and biodiversity. So in areas where there was more tree cover, where there was more forest, they found that the children as well as the mothers had a higher diversity of their diet. And there are several pathways that are underneath this. The most obvious one is that people also actually consume foods from the forest. But there are many other hypotheses that have not been looked into so much. So here an example of in a case study in Ethiopia, and you see this is it's more or less 4 hours south of Addis Ababa, and you see that there's still a small part of natural forest left on this side, while you have an agriculture intensification gradient as you move towards a small town which is called Ausinigiri, which has a big road where many trucks passes and where there's an increasing market activity going on. So, and so I will discuss this across this gradient with the landscape that is near to the forest, then the landscape that is intermediate to the forest, and then the landscape that is the most distant to the forest, which is the most close to the road. And this also adds to this point that the previous speaker made about it's important that we understand the changes of these landscapes and how they are used and how the markets are functioning in these landscapes. And originally this was all forest, but so the agriculture intensification gradient has changed how this landscape looks. And what we find is that in terms of food security, there's a slightly lower food security in the middle area, but there is in general not that much of a trend across the gradient. While for dietary diversity, you see that the area close to the forest has a much higher dietary diversity than the area further away from the forest, close to the roads. While many studies that look at a larger scale show actually that as you have market access, people have more diet diversity. But if you actually zoom into some of these landscapes, this is not always the case. And if we look at why this is, we actually found that people don't consume foods from the forest in this case. But the areas close to the forest have many more home gardens, and the diversity in these home gardens is much more than in the home gardens further away from the forest, where they have almost no home gardens anymore. As well as the amount of these home gardens and the diversity of these home gardens is also dependent of the number of livestock that the households have in these landscapes, which this picture shows. The more livestock they have, the more home gardens they have, and the more diversity in their home gardens. What we found, to be short, is by putting a lot of different qualitative as well as quantitative data together, is that the forest actually, people go and graze with the cattle in the forest. So the forest gives feed to the livestock, which allows them to have a more healthier livestock and to also have more animals than the people further away from the forest. And the livestock gives, on one hand, livestock products for them to consume, as well as manure that they use directly in the home gardens, and that allows a larger biological diversity in the production system. So it's not the wild biodiversity, but it's the biological diversity in the home gardens, which was also mentioned in the previous presentations, which is associated actually with a larger bird diversity, which another study showed in the same area. And if you look closer to the road, further away from the forest, you see that people use actually the manure as fuel, and they don't use it on their land. So this, to make a short story, that because of the interaction with the forest and because of the livestock that goes grazing into the forest, they are able to maintain a more diverse production system. And of course, this raises a lot of questions. What is the sustainability of the forest by having this livestock go grazing in the forest? What is the added value of this biodiversity in the production system from an ecological point of view? And also from a social point of view, you see that on the markets, for example, they don't function yet in this area. So you see that across the year, the diversity of food that is available on the landscape, the blue one that is close to the forest, is much higher than in the landscapes that are further away from the forest. So the local market mechanisms, how can they contribute, or how can we manage the local market mechanisms to better manage the diversity in the system? So to add a couple of key research priorities on this relatively simple but provocative case study is, one, I think it's very important that we add very clearly this nutrition dimension to the discussion of food security and biodiversity. This has been mentioned already. Second is that we monitor the agriculture biodiversity together with the natural biodiversity, and we look at the interactions between them, as was also mentioned in the previous talk actually. And third, that we understand the local food system together with the land use, the landscape dynamics, because the way the market functions in these landscapes determines a lot how people interact with their production system as well as their biodiversity. Yeah, thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Rosamund. And our last speaker is going to be Jai Chappell from Coventry University.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm going to talk very briefly, for contrast with myself, about why I think we need to be deeply social, both in our research and in our interactions, if we want to be at all successful in being ecological and conserving biodiversity, much less achieving food security. And I hope my presentation will be provocative and entertaining. In that, it's maybe a little bit like an episode of The Simpsons that was narrated by the late Leonard Nimoy, which he said was going to be full of lies, but they were entertaining lies, so wasn't that what was really important? No, that's not what's really important. And so, unlike that, this is not going to be filled with lies. Rather, the point is that I'm going to go over some of what I think might be called gratifying misconceptions that I think a lot of us have. I think many of us are in the job of creating evidence and trying to think of how we can help systems work better. But what's the evidence that evidence is important? I think very few of us have looked at that. Implicitly or explicitly, I think a lot of us have something like this model of policy formation and social change in our mind, where you think of what issue you're talking about, you build an agenda, you design your solutions, you implement them, it's all very nice, and that hopefully scientific evidence will make each of these steps more effective, more efficient, maybe more likely to happen or go more quickly. Unfortunately, if you look at the political science literature, Paul Kearney, the political scientist, says that this approach is not really central in political science anymore because it doesn't really explain what it describes, which if you think about it is kind of the most damning description of something you could have in terms of scientific accuracy. So Kearney goes on to say that a scientist seeking to influence the policymaking process should identify how it works and seek to influence it on that basis, not on the basis of how we would like it to work. And so to understand only one aspect of evidence-based policymaking, whether that's our own evidence or this inaccurate model, is to reject evidence-based policymaking because the evidence is against that model. And I think that there's a huge danger to this. I will use a very colorful and vivid analogy from the late British veterinarian James Herriot, who was talking about a time that he and colleagues were trying to restore a cow's organ to a place where it should actually be, and they realized after a while that rather than getting it back into the cow, they were pushing it through a hole in the sheet. And it reminded his boss of a time actually that he said he spent half a morning trying to stuff a cow's uterus up its rectum. The thing of it, he said, that really worried him was that he almost succeeded. If we don't pay very close attention to how systems actually work, even if we have a lot of relevant expertise, we can do things that are very wrong. And this might seem like a very dramatic, overly graphic analogy, but I don't think it is, in that if we look at conservation biology and the history of it, there's numerous examples where good science, not just bad science, good science has been used in expropriating people from their land, in generating conflict, in extracting knowledge from communities. Literally, people have died as a result of conservation's interactions with the political system. Of course, it's not the only cause of it, but it was part of it, and we can't ignore that. And I think a really important corollary to this is, as we've talked about the 9 to 10 billion people that we will have to feed, the geographer Anne Larimore has pointed out, every time we cite that number, we're assuming the further depression of many women, because many women choose to have less children when they have that right. And so if you make that assumption, you're being political. There's a saying that numbers are violently political, and that is one of them. It would be like saying we're going to extrapolate how many slaves there will be in a certain year in the United States, or how much rape there will be. That's not scientifically inaccurate, but I'd say it's irresponsible to stop there because you're assuming injustice. So in food systems and conservation, to be a little more specific to the topic of this area, I think it's similar, and there's definitely a history of, I would say, good ideas being used in a way that might lead to bad results. And productivism might be one example of this. The idea that making more is sort of always a good idea, and always part of the solution to the problems with food security. And I think that if we look at the evidence again, I'd say the best evidence to date on how food security has been increased over the past several decades comes from Smith and Haddad. And if you look at this, around 20% of the decrease in hunger in the developing countries has been from increased production, which is not nothing, but I would say very many of us who work on biodiversity conservation and food security don't spend very much time on the other 80%, which to me makes no sense. So we have unasked questions in terms of what these other factors, how they relate to biodiversity, as well as what we can do to support them for their own good. And so this brings me to my last point in terms of how does social change happen and how is trust built? In order for us to accomplish what we would like, which is changes in the world, I think that's why we're generating evidence, we also have to remember that often we are going to communities or society and we're saying a sacrifice has to be made, something has to be changed, some kind of behavior has to be changed. And if we look at the research on how humans generally work, of course, it's very complex, but one of the things in terms of how it works is reciprocity, that we do things for each other. So if as scientists we're going to policymakers or communities or even other scientists and we're saying you have to sacrifice or change or participate in this new initiative, how much are we doing that with them? If they ask for a certain kind of research from us, for a change, are we willing to do that if it's outside of our immediate interest of publishing a paper or getting a grant or creating better evidence? And if we're not willing to do something on our own part to change, then how can we reasonably expect that they might do something as well? So it's not really just research priorities I'm concerned with, but I think that it's vitally important for us to think about how change actually happens if we want to affect it, if that's what we're concerned with at all. And there's lots of different literatures and theories to look at, which is annoying if you just want to sort of get there and move on. But I think that it behooves us to learn about this because the damage can be so great if we don't. So we need to understand the history and implications as well. If you think of reciprocity again, if we're working with communities that might have a memory or have heard of the damage done in other communities, you might not understand why there's reluctance. But coming from the United States, I definitely vividly understand that if you come to someone and say, I want to help you, and you don't understand the history of maybe not helping that particular place, it can be very difficult to be effective. And so I think we need to, in the end, work with communities and people as other people. And when you do that, you can't just ask for them to contribute to your work. Even if your work is good, even if your work is very important to the survival of humankind, people don't work that way. You have to also be offering something of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see if my microphone's on. Is it on? Very good. And so with that, we'd like to ask the speakers to come to the front, please, for a bit of a discussion. And the hope very much is that we indeed manage to have a discussion rather than just a question and answer session. So I encourage our speakers to also talk to one another. And in fact, that's going to be my first question that I'm going to throw at this before opening to the audience in a short while. And that is there any burning points that any of you have to raise with each other on the basis of what you've learned so far from each other? So is there any burning comments that you have on the basis of what you've heard from each other to start with? Be shy.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was very interesting to see some of the similar points as well as some of the different emphasis and points in the different presentations. I think also the different scales came across very clearly across the different presentations, but they also raised very different questions. And one question that I wanted to ask to Lina, actually, when you mentioned your favorite Swedish farmer, we also visited some farmers like that in Switzerland that were really investing in biodiversity practices, but they were very heavily subsidized. Without government subsidies, they would not survive, and it was a subsidy that in a country like Ethiopia is just not realistic. So I wanted to ask also in the case of the Swedish farmer, how does he economically survive?
No, subsidies is a very important, a big part of the picture here as well, and that's something when I've discussed with him also what are different kind of leverage points for change, and he's saying you have to look at the subsidies because they're so dominant in what's on farmers' fields today. For this particular guy, he's very special, and I don't think in some ways I think he's a role model, but I don't think it's something that's totally scalable to everyone. He's also extremely active on social media, for example, and he's gone from more, and he's also started to sell a lot of his own produce in different types of sort of social media channels and directly to consumers and to some high-end restaurants and so on. So he's actually reduced his dependence on subsidies because he can make enough profit now, also having kind of a story around his farm and so on, that he can take a higher price on his product. So I think that's made him reduce the subsidies. But I do think that subsidies is a huge part of the picture. Maybe another thing I just want to raise, because in our other session also, Jamila Haider, who's also in the audience here, talked about the food culture in the Pamir Mountains, and that's also where they have such a high diversity of crops that are important in their food culture. But that's also something that's changing with increased interventions in the area, and sort of increased subsidies international subsidies that's coming in as food aid, and they get access to other types of crops. So that's sort of, tell me if I'm wrong here, but sort of undermining some of their culture and what's driving the biodiversity, agricultural biodiversity in that area. So I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but sort of reflecting to it a bit.
Yeah, I think subsidies in agriculture in the EU are a major point. 50% of the income of the farmers comes from these subsidies, and there's this market protection. So it's, on the other hand, I think you could also argue that for these huge subsidies that you don't have in other countries like in Australia and of course not in more developing countries, that you could expect much more for society in terms of whatever, environmental protection, etc. So this failed EU agricultural policy is really terrible, and it's all a complete disaster. But I would like to come to these Ethiopian examples, which are of course case studies from this very region, but I think also this can be quite different compared to what you showed. I will remember that there's a recent publication from India, for example, showing that farmers, smallholders with diversified crop production, that their diets are less diverse than of farmers with monocrops, which have cash crops, which have a higher income level and which are able to diversify much more their diets. Mm-hmm. And also, just to point out that there are so many different avenues of development, or what you said with the distance to the forest, that they have less diverse diets because, or when they are more distant to the forest, which has often to do with market access, and market access has also to do with building roads. So is a solution to build roads, which is known as a major destructor of rainforest. So there, as I would say, also the political recommendations can easily go in the wrong directions when you when you come from certain regions and certain studies. So it's really complicated. I don't have a solution, but just wanted to point it out.
Do you feel the urge to respond to that immediately, or should I throw in another thought? So I guess one of the key challenges that I see from all of this is that we have this mess that we agree with that has multiple scales, but then we have these global issues and the local issues, but then we also have these very different realities of smallholders in Ethiopia versus people going to luxury restaurants in Stockholm. So how do we get these things connected? And aren't we fooling ourselves if we think that like a bit of more conscious diets up here in the West, where we can go to nice fancy restaurants and eat our nice little lunchtime, whatever they're going to serve us, which is going to look very nice and stuff, that this has anything to do at all, in fact, with the livelihoods of people in some of these places where food security actually matters at the moment. So how do we connect up these different things? And it seems like the narrative implies they are somehow connected, but are they actually connected? And what's the sort of unpleasant political side behind that, maybe?
Seems like I have to say something to that, maybe. I had the fancy restaurant on my slide, but no, I mean, that's also something that we've been discussing, and of course, but I think they are, and I see fancy restaurants and chefs as having an important part of solving the picture, not because exactly what they do at their individual restaurants, but in the way that they can enhance kind of our focus on the quality of the food that we are producing and eating. So if we've gone from a narrative that has been so much driven about volume and maximizing kind of productivity on farm, how do we get to a narrative that's about the quality that we're eating? And I think there they have a very important role to play in showing what can be a good, what can be a tasty food system. When I think about a food, sort of healthy and sustainable diet, the first thing I get in my picture, at least before, was sort of this some type of lentil stew that was sort of a brown mess almost. It was not at all so exciting to me to eat. But if I think about what could be a really tasty meal, it doesn't have to be like that. And so in creating images that are attractive, I think they have a role to play. I also think they have a role to play in cases that we were talking about the Pamir Mountains, or probably in Ethiopia has such a rich food culture. So how can we celebrate that richness of a food culture and not just look at sort of where the Western diet and diets that are not so good for us sort of become the dominant part of what people are eating. So sort of getting to celebration of diversity, dietary diversity and quality, I think that's a kind of a main point of that.
What is the link to global food security?
Well, linked to global food security is that the way that we're consuming now is not very resource efficient also. So we're eating, if we go on a business as usual trajectory, we're eating way too much meat, and that's what we see in the future trajectory also, and that is not very resource efficient. So if all the modeling studies also for a global food system is that if we shift to a more plant-based diet, we don't have to go all the way to be vegan, but with alternative patterns, we don't need as much land and as much resources going into agriculture. So we free up more space. So that's one. I feel like I'm talking too much. And waste, of course, is another one. Yeah, now I have to.
I'd like Jai to comment briefly, and then we'll see whether we also want to get some questions from the audience here, who I'm sure have some questions. So let's get started. Jai, you wanted to say something? And then maybe Christopher, did you have something on this point as well? Short point on this, and then we go open up to the audience, okay?
So Jörn said to be short, so I have a 45-minute presentation I'd like to, no. So I think one non-obvious way that these are connected as well actually is food prices, and I think actually food prices are too low. I think that's objectively what the science says insofar as that's possible. And if you look at like natural capital impacts, food prices are around 50% too low. Now there is of course this whole political element. If you raise prices by 50% for a lot of people, but the longer term impacts are very interesting. Derek Heddy, among other economists, has looked at the food crisis of the 2008-2009, and his research indicates that over the long term, which for an economist is 1 to 5 years apparently, over the long term, the poverty has decreased in developing countries because of the crisis, because prices went up, farmers got most of that price, and actually that bid up wages not just in the countryside, but in urban areas in some cases, because it made farming more competitive as a job, and so wages had to go up in urban areas to compete. Of course, you have to have other policies around that. You can't just jack up prices and wait for it to adjust. But I think that that's an opportunity actually we don't even talk about, that maybe one way these things can be linked. More expensive food in the north also means food produced locally in the south is more competitive.
Let's hear from Christopher briefly, and then I'll open up to the audience.
Yeah, you mentioned the Ethiopian food culture, which is, I think it's interesting that a poor country can have such a rich food culture and be proud of that. And that proudness, I think, so that in a way that linked to those fancy restaurants in Sweden also, that there is a proudness of these varieties, etc. And that could also, so in that sense I think there could be a link. And some other communities, they don't have that proudness, and they just see that we are poor in all different respects in terms of different things. But this proudness of food in Ethiopia is one of a really big strength in this case, I think.
Okay, let's open up to the audience. I think we had one early hand there, so we'll get started. Maybe just say the question loudly and I'll repeat it once so that everyone can hear it.
Yes, thank you very much, especially for you in the beginning and Jari at the end, because you pointed out the criticism about certain often cited large-scale aggregate figures, like from the FAO and United Nations Population Division, and which are used again and again to frame the discussion in a very restrictive way. That was such a good thing to hear, because I'm actually presenting about the same topic today. But one thing, this is more of a comment, but you may have insights into why things are like that is that FAO is such a huge authority in these discussions, and it sort of tends to frame every presentation or every article sort of the global issue is framed by. And on the one hand, FAO has the line that, well, population is going to grow to X billion people, and we need X percent more food, 50% by 2030 or 2050. The figure switches around a little. But at the same time, in the same reports, FAO has been in recent years forcefully proposing that the focus should be shifting on small-scale farming and food security. And they are criticizing the simplistic notion of hunger as only calorie-based. They are putting forward the nutrition agenda. So of course you have a huge institution where you have sort of conflicting inner voices, but do you have any thoughts on how it might be possible to sort of strengthen those voices from the FAO that are putting forward food security and the nutrition side?
I'll just briefly paraphrase in case not everyone heard it clearly. So FAO has two narratives at the moment. One narrative is we must double food production for the richer and more people that we're going to be, and on the other hand also a rising narrative of smallholder and increasingly seen as important. How can we strengthen this narrative that smallholders matter, if I paraphrase that more or less correctly? So any thoughts on that from you guys? Christopher and Jahi?
A very, very short analogy from this very landscape where I've been working. When you talk to the farmers, they of course are interested in food security, and they might be interested in profit. By what government agencies they are focusing on, that the overall production in the country should increase. So they tell them, please use these improved seeds. And the farmers say, yes, they say, and then they put the seeds on the shelf, and then they use their other seeds because they are afraid that the improved seed will be rated more than the way they are doing. So there are different levels have different aims. So it's super important to come to some kind of trust and discussion so that we could work together instead of this mistrust.
So this is also a scale issue, right? Like
yes.
We've got many scale issues here, and if you got these national statistics, then food security looks like it has improved if the total amount of calories grown in the country has gone up, which may or may not be the case.
So I mean, I guess the answer is that we need to simultaneously talk about food security and also the production and the amount of food and how that is distributed.
So I had two quick things. One was that also on that number in food demand, within the FAO report, they also admit that for one thing that's measured in dollars, that's not measured in kilograms or something like that. So it's not a great measure of how much food production we actually need. And it's based on the total economic projection of the sector size, not demand per se, but how large the market will be. So it's already a lot fuzzier than we start with. But also there's something very direct I think we can do in terms of narratives that you might care about within the FAO. Having worked with the FAO a little bit over the past several years on agroecology, they point out that they are constrained by their member governments. They can't go beyond what the member governments will endorse. And especially those of us in the global north, especially people like me from the States, that's one of the biggest obstacles. If we can have our governments, any government, they pointed out, ask for specific things, the FAO can then respond. And so the agroecology meetings they had were because France and Brazil requested it and actually ended up being able to out-argue Australia and the United States. They said if even a single country asks for something, they can respond to it. So making sure your government, wherever you are, is asking for this type of information or this narrative can by itself give more space for those voices to be heard.
Tia had a comment and then we'll go for another question.
Yeah, I think all this debate on food demand, of course, has a huge disadvantage that it does not take into account many important parameters. Meat production has been mentioned. Waste, of course, is an important point, especially also waste in those situations where poverty is dominating, where losses of storage plays a big role, 30 to 50%, where you have a lot of losses also on the field. So there's a lot of technical improvement possible, which definitely would decrease these overall demands. So the small-scale focus and small-scale aid is definitely extremely important. And I say that because, for example, the German development aid just switched to model farms in African countries instead of helping on small-scale farm what they did in the past, which is definitely terrible because these huge farms, and of course they produce a lot of cash crops, show that there is something possible, but which is not at all linked to improvement of the situation of the poor.
Lothar has a burning point, and then we'll grab another question from right at the front here.
Yeah, I just want to add one point to that, because I think the question about the smallholders is also that it's not just about the production. And we just published a study together with a group of Mario Herrero that the areas where you have smallholder farms are also the more diverse areas. So, and that points out that if you look beyond production, the smallholders have many other functions to play. And I think that is a point that we need to make, and in this discussion also to link that agriculture biodiversity with natural biodiversity, where the smallholders add more value than the large-scale production systems.
It was more a question for Line. I don't know if you had any idea on how do you think the private sector and companies or multinationals could understand the planetary boundaries and the impact they may have through food on the planetary boundaries, and how could they understand it and then do something about it? If you had any thought on this, maybe.
I don't know, but I think there is a growing interest. I know there are many private sector companies. Some of my colleagues have talked with H&M or working with H&M, which is a big clothes company, for example. Isn't it Houdini is another clothes company? Had discussion with L'Oreal. Not so much yet in the food sector, but there are like private business companies that are really interested in how can we take the planetary boundaries and use it to something that's useful for us, so that we can see our sort of contribution to it. But so I think there is an interest. I don't know how. I'm not sure exactly yet where it's going, but yeah.
Let's have a look. We've got a lot more questions. So let's try to get some more questions in by people. I think you had your hand up earlier already, so let's go for your question.
Hello, my question is to Jai. How can we as scientists help to overcome this productionist paradigm that's still so prevailing in science, policy, and practice? And what may be the role of prominent concepts like resilience in that?
Well, I think there's many things we can do. One of them, I think, is take seriously Jörn's point, and that they've mentioned in some of their papers and our joint papers. If we actually spend our scientific papers talking about these other factors, rather than saying, production, by the way, also political rights. If the focus of the paper is on these other elements, that is one thing we can do in our science, and resilience thinking certainly offers a potential to think beyond just production. And so if that's not the focus of your paper, if that's the side note and the rights or political parts of the core, that's important. The other thing I think is, personally, I think we haven't done enough within our own institutions to have our institutions use their leverage what they have in terms of making a unified suggestion. Again, going back to the point the gentleman made about the FAO, to say, as Stockholm Resilience Center or Coventry Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, that, okay, you have to emphasize these points on smallholders, on agroecology, because that's what the science says. Having your government ask the FAO for that could be very powerful.
I'd like to allow a few more people to ask, because we had quite a lot of hands. So we'll start so I get something from the back as well. Sorry, Albert. There, you had your hand up in the back there. Yes, please.
My question was more around the meta-narrative that I'm hearing. And what I hear people saying is that with cost-price issues, kind of a market solution, and subsidies is a more public policy solution. But really what we're looking at is the value of labor being at least equal to the value of capital. that to do that means focusing not just on farming in isolation, but the entire supply chain and the entire population, so that people have enough money to actually purchase product at a 50% higher rate, and that farmers are able to actually make a living farming, and that people want to farm because they can make a living doing that. So I just wanted to put that out there and see what you have to say with that.
Did people hear that everywhere? More or less? Yeah, even in the back? Okay, so fine. Anyone who's keen on taking that question?
Yes.
That was the shortest I've ever heard of. Amazing. Lena, anything you would like to add to that?
No, but it's an interesting and valid point, I think. So, yes.
Okay, we'll grab another question then. So, agreement on this. Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, I think I missed 2 points. I don't know whether you would like to elaborate more on those because have been already mentioned. One is about food waste, which is very much related. I think one of the problems that we have in food production is food distribution or distribution of issues. So we keep hearing this thing about like now that we need to produce more food because there will be more people, and there's no still, I think, enough evidence to back up that. So we're not sure if we need more food or we need to distribute it better. I would rather think it might be closer to the second one. And the other thing is that we need to reduce food waste. No? So I don't know if you guys would like to elaborate more on all this. And the other point would be about the mismatch also between biocapacity, to say in a short way, and the capability of ecosystems to provide food and population distribution. So we have areas in the world where an increasingly high density of populations that are have a very little capacity to produce food, no? And let's say the Middle East or and Dubai. And there are areas in which we have the opposite, right? We have like a very fertile, very productive with relatively low density of population. There is a mismatch there, in a way. If we want to relocalize, or if we think that small-scale farming would be somehow something interesting to look at in terms of social ecological sustainability of the food system, but then how does that crunch with reducing food chains and reducing the impact of the agri-food business and industry in the way we deal with food and land management?
Well, I'll just quickly say, less quickly than the previous answer, that I think that food prices, again, are part of that narrative. That's part of why we waste. People waste less of something that costs more. And actually, even in Brazil, in a couple of exceptional cities, they have a por kilo cafeterias where you weigh the whole plate and what you eat. At a couple cities, they have it where they charge you for what's left on your plate as well. So there's a lot of interesting approaches in terms of food price and waste that I think would help, and also could change the distribution of labor and where people live in terms of prices and wages.
Yeah, I also think that prices are too low, that's for sure. But on the other hand, I think this is also an effect of the an effect of our luxurious lifestyle. Very simple. When you have the supermarket full of fresh food, and people want to have fresh food, I think this is a consequence that a lot of things are wasted. And many single households are buying more than they can eat at once, etc. So I think to change this will be very difficult, because we have too much money on average, and we are in a too good situation. I think much more important would be, I think the same amount of waste is with storage of after harvest and after harvest losses in the third world, and there should be put some research on and effort and money into it to avoid these extreme losses also after harvest. That's my feeling.
Thank you. And we have more questions. You've given up, Albert?
I still, if you want, if I'm allowed.
I was so rude to you earlier, so please.
Just first, really thanks for great sort of talks. It's given someone a bit uninitiated a nice overview of the field. On one hand, we hear though a story of increased global connectedness, a few single key actors, distant production, but then we also hear that 90% of the world's farms are really small scale, and I'm just thinking, is there a risk of generating two new narratives that aren't really reconcilable? I'm just thinking, what's the research, what's the trend of this increased subsumation within markets, and is there a typology of how increased market access is affecting these different scales of farms? Just a few reflections on that, if you have any.
I think it's a very important, a very interesting point, because I totally agree. There is this kind of divided world in some ways that have these alternative pathways, but I think it's very important because I think large part of the world are also in transitions between these different kind of narratives, or going from very small scale to rapidly becoming more larger scale. I don't think that it's necessarily, not all of that is bad. I mean, like, part of the reply to the last question is also that trade is really important globally in evening out also some of the differences that we have. But we need to be better at understanding and understand the transitions between these different worlds, and how can we make that transition into something that's less bad for food security and diversity.
I think it's also interesting to contemplate that it's only about 12 to 15% of food that crosses international lines. So I'd say actually the huge influence is actually the amount of money and capital involved in it, that's a disproportionate influence compared to the size of the trade flows. And one of the very revolutionary ideas I've heard recently was from the economist Duncan Foley, talking about carbon more generally in society and climate. And he said that the welfare benefits are so great of getting rid of coal companies and other companies that are doing problematic things that society should buy them out to be out of business, pay them to do something different. And if you look at some of these businesses where food is 50% undervalued, I think we need to think about that approach, because some companies, I think, scientifically should not exist. I don't think there's a scientific justification for some of these companies, but we're not going to negotiate them out of existence. So perhaps this sort of buying them out is maybe an option forward.
We've got a couple of minutes left before I'll leave it to Jan to see if we can wrap up a bit with areas of agreement and disagreement. I want to get back once before you guys are left to go your own way, to go back to biodiversity once. We talked a lot about food security. On biodiversity, I'm interested in what do you feel are emerging areas that we really, I feel like I've heard from all of you who specifically talked about it. I've heard something about small-scale farming being useful in the context of biodiversity conservation. Did I hear that wrong, or is this something that you would argue is definitely the case? Thea?
I think it's important for a certain part of biodiversity only, this open land, let's say, biodiversity. But when it comes to the huge amount of biodiversity which is restricted to forests, of course it is, and there are many species where even small disturbances are negative, as you know better than me. Let's say understory insectivorous birds, which are easily disturbed and are vanishing. So it's very clear that you need to protect the last remnants of natural forest everywhere. And this is kind of priority. But you still have a lot of biodiversity here and there. But in the open land, which is less endangered and can have a great functional significance, obviously. But it has been shown recently, for example, for pollinating birds, for pollinating bees, that 80% of the bees don't play a role in crop pollination, for example, and only 20% of the bee species, which are still a large amount, and you can still have a biodiversity effect. So on crop pollination, so the more bee species you have, the higher your yield and the higher the quality of the fruit. But still, it's only a small amount of sector. So I think it's very important to emphasize that we have an ethic responsibility for protecting biodiversity, and this also means to have reserves and to keep them.
So you're arguing for a combination then of approaches, if I understand.
Yeah.
And Christopher, maybe a brief comment, and then maybe we go over to Jan for a wrap-up of areas of disagreement and agreement. Christopher.
Yeah, I would just like to agree with Thea, but also come back to the point that you made about the focus on fields and local is often problematic. So if you raise your eyes and look at larger areas, then it might be more possible to combine protection of rare species or habitat specialists with different kind of, both within the agriculture systems but also in less disturbed areas. So again, a scale issue. So that is, I think, very important when you discuss this thing. A lot of focus is always on this farm level or field level. Also, for example, the criteria for certification is often what you put in this area, not the context where it is produced in a larger scale.
Okay, let's hand over to Jan then for a wrap-up of areas of agreement and disagreement.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have the pleasure for the last 3 minutes to wrap up this very rich, intense and nuanced discussion into simplified binary categories of agreement and disagreement. And this is my take on it. You might have different opinions on how to put things here. So I'd like to start with parts of agreement. It's relatively difficult to extract that from what you said, but there are 3 points that I have here. And I start with scale. So most of you were saying that we need to focus more strongly on different scales, look at different characteristics that play a role at different scales. So be scale specific, and especially have a focus on the more local and landscape scale, less so on the global scale. And also look at more interactions between scales, look at more interactions also within a landscape in order to grasp the complexity of the system and to understand more deeply what drives food security and what drives biodiversity in such a system. Second, I sense the strong agreement that we need to further move away from the sole focus on food production, away to something else. And third, I took that framing of the question is very important and very much defines of what we do and to which conclusions we come. Framing of the questions in terms of often we start with global numbers and then go to the local scale. So this going from the global scale down to the local might not be such a good approach, or should be something that we should question or test. And then also starting from the temperate region and generalizing to the tropics, for example, or starting from the rich countries and going to the poorer countries. So these are the 3 things that I took as agreement, and now quickly I go to disagreement. I didn't feel there was a disagreement there strongly, so I'd like to take it away and turn it into divergence. So points that were raised differently, divergence, by different peoples. And for one, this was the focus maybe away from a single measure of food security which is available, or the amount of food that is there, towards more richer view on it, towards nutrition, towards diets, towards points of health, and to look at more other drivers of food security like waste or food prices. So basically these 2 points directly link to here. So shift away from the production focus to some other aspects that are relevant and haven't been considered so much so far. Particularly Jai was mentioning processes are important. We should look at political processes, we should look at social processes, social change that are relevant, and that's maybe also relevant for the different narratives that we have. So we often assume like a static view, but every system is in change and it's complex, and we need to consider that in our work. Then one other point was the link between ecosystem service and biodiversity. This might not be as straightforward as it's often implied. Complexity is important, indirect effects, and last, the role of scientists that might be. We had the topic of empathy earlier on in other sessions, and I think it's very important, and it also resonates with Jai said. So, for example, is getting into contact with stakeholders, better understanding, deeper understanding what drives food security, maybe also what drives biodiversity, getting this deep knowledge. Okay, is there anything important missing?
I think we don't have time, so no, everything important has been said. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and all of you for showing up in large numbers. I think it was a nice session. Thank you very much.
Diversity and nutrition. So, yeah, maybe we can keep in touch.
Thrilled with you and everything.